This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is David Lloyd. I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of South Australia. And I'm hugely pleased to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre and the School of Law, who jointly present the UniSA Nelson Mandela Lecture. Before we kick off tonight's proceedings, I would like to ask Uncle Lewis O'Brien to join me on stage to welcome us all to Garner Country.
Marawachanga, Ghana Bian and Wangani, Mani the Bundagana, Yatana, Naibiriko, Mankalankala, Tandanya, Mianaku, Nature Yongandalia, Nature Yakanadalia, Padnadlu Wadu. On behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Ghana Country, and I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. I had the occasion to fly to Peru in 2011. Half an hour into the flight, the pilot came on the intercom and he said, passengers, I have to tell you that number 4 engine's just dropped out, but everything's okay, we'll be just half an hour late in Lima in Peru. Then another half an hour went by and he came on the intercom again, he said, passengers, I have to tell you that number 2 engine's overheated and we have to shut it down. Everything's okay, the 2 engines will get us to Peru, but we'll be an hour late. Another half an hour went by and he got on the intercom again and he said, number 3 engine's overheated and we have to shut that down, but don't worry, the 1 engine will get us to Peru, we'll be an hour and a half late. 10 minutes later, the bloke next to me said, mate, if that last engine goes, we'll be up here all night.
Thank you, Uncle Lewis. The Nelson Mandela Lecture Series was established in honour of one of the world's greatest humanitarian figures, the late Nelson Mandela. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of South Australia in 1998 and was the international patron of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre from 2001 until 2013. The purpose of this lecture series is to promote the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals and the value of truth and reconciliation in life and public affairs. The session tonight is being recorded and a video will be available on the Hawke Centre website later next week. So for pity's sake, please turn off your phones. Please. With the many avenues which are available today for the dissemination of information on radio, TV and the internet via social media, this lecture will be available to many more people than are here present tonight. We therefore encourage you to bring this to the attention of your friends and colleagues who could not be with us for the occasion. We have a large number of special guests here tonight, in particular our distinguished guests, the Honourable Bob Hawke, former Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Nick Balkis, former Australian Senator, and I am especially delighted to welcome our speakers, the Honourable Michael Kirby AC, CMG, and Geoffrey Robertson QC. Michael is especially pleased to see me wearing a tie. There's a first time for everything, Mike. I'm also known to occasionally reference Irish literature in my addresses, so to book that trend tonight, I'm going to quote an American poet, Robert Frost, who wrote one of my favourite poems. But I'm not going to quote a poem, I'm going to quote something he said which was rather funny, because we like to introduce some humour in my speeches from time to time. He said that a jury consists of 12 people chosen to decide who has the better lawyer. And a jury tonight would be hard-pressed to make that decision. The Honourable Michael Kirby, AC, CMG, is a renowned human rights expert and defender, both nationally and internationally. He is also admired for his sustained leadership and the advocacy of social and legal reform. He's an international jurist, educator and former judge. He served as the Deputy President of the Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission, Chairman of the Australian Law Reform Commission, Judge of the Federal Court of Australia, President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, President of the Court of Appeal of the Solomon Islands and a Justice of the High Court of Australia. Michael has undertaken many international activities for the United Nations, the Commonwealth Secretariat, the OECD, the Global Fund Against AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria. He's worked in civil society, being elected President of the International Commission of Jurists in the mid-90s. His recent international activities have included being a member of the Eminent Persons Group on the Future of Commonwealth of Nations, Commissioner of the UNDP Global Commission on HIV and the Law, Chairman of the UN Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, member of the UN Secretary-General's High-Level Panel on Access to Essential Healthcare. Michael is heavily engaged in international arbitrations, domestic mediations and teaching law. He's an honorary professor at 12 Australian and overseas universities. In the 1990s, the Honourable Michael Kirby was awarded the Australian Human Rights Medal. In 1998, he was named Laureate of the UNESCO Prize for Human Rights Education. In 2010, he was named the co-winner of the Gruber Justice Prize. In 2011, he received the inaugural Australian Privacy Medal. The honorary degrees of Doctor of Letters, Doctor of Laws, Doctor of the University have been confirmed on him by universities in Australia and internationally. He has been a great friend to the University of South Australia's Law School, which pleasingly was ranked among the world's top 100 law schools last week and number one in the state in just its 10th year of operation. Michael, tonight, is in conversation with Geoffrey Robertson, QC, a human rights barrister, academic, author and broadcaster. He is one of the most esteemed figures in the world of law and human rights. Geoffrey is a founder and joint head of the Doughty Street Chambers, a British set of barristers' chambers which takes on cases of criminal justice, public law, immigration, employment, human rights and civil liberties. He serves as a Master of the Bench at the Middle Temple, a recorder and is a visiting professor at the Queen Mary University of London. He's been counsel in many landmark cases in constitutional, criminal and media law in the courts of Britain and the Commonwealth, and he makes frequent appearances in the Privy Council and the European Courts of Human Rights. He's an advocate, writer and media star. Who among us could forget Geoffrey Robertson's Hypotheticals, his TV show, which ran with some pauses between episodes from 1985 to 2014, in which Geoffrey surrounded himself with various politicians, academics and well-known personalities to argue the case for subjects such as whether we have a right to determine our own health, or has that right been assumed by doctors, lawyers and ethics committees? Or when should a state intervene to remove a child from parents on suspicion of sexual abuse? Through his advocacy in many high-profile legal battles, he's contributed to public understanding of the law, and both he and the Honourable Michael Kirby have played pivotal roles in breaking down the barriers that may have prevented ordinary citizens from getting a close-up understanding of the law that governs their lives. Tonight, their conversation will put a spotlight on the role of human rights and whether it can combat the ills of our time, like racism, sexism, homophobia, discrimination and poverty, and whether there's an obligation in all of us to remember the lessons of Nelson Mandela and to apply them on our day-to-day lives in our own community. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to two of Australia's greatest legal minds, the Honourable Michael Kirby, AC, CMG, in conversation with Geoffrey Robertson, QC.
Oh, come off and say something already. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along tonight to this curious event when you get to eavesdrop on the conversation of two aging judges. On the way up, we wondered what we'd talk about, and I jotted down on an envelope a few issues that you might be interested to hear us on. And the first was, what was so wrong about apartheid? Michael.
Well, there was an awful lot wrong about apartheid, and it took Nelson Mandela, with his amazing grace, emerging from Robben Island after 28 years and 7 months, to demonstrate the wrongness of those years. And I should, just as a footnote, say that I had the honour to meet him in 1990, soon after he was released. Bob Hawke told me tonight, and I'm very honoured and delighted that Bob is here with us tonight. He told me that, I'd forgotten this, that Nelson Mandela chose Australia to be the first overseas country to which he would come. And Bob Hawke, then Prime Minister, to be the first whom he would meet as a free man. And Bob Hawke, as the head of the ACTU, had made a big difference in rallying the union movement and standing up against what had happened, or what was happening in South Africa. But subsequently I was appointed by the ILO to an inquiry in South Africa to investigate what was very wrong in their labour laws, and that took me there, and I met Nelson Mandela then, and we made recommendations about the improvement of the labour laws, which discriminated so shockingly against the black community in South Africa. And all of those Nelson Mandela, when he became president, brought into effect. But he had a wonderful memory, and he remembered that when he had been put on trial 28 years and 7 months before and sent to Robben Island, the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva had sent Ted Sinjin, an Australian QC and lawyer, to observe the trial. And Mandela thought that it was possible, certainly beneficial to him, that Ted Sinjin was there, because the judge, Justice De Wet, could have sentenced him to death. But he held back from that, and for the charge of conspiracy, he sentenced him to life imprisonment. That's what he served. So, and Nelson Mandela remembered that. I was then the chairman of the ICJ. He sent a message to Australia that when he was inaugurated as president, he wanted me there, and I went there, and he welcomed me that day. And it was just that he remembered who had been his friends and who had not been his friends. But apartheid was a system that condemned people for who they were, humiliated them, disadvantaged them, and he took the steps that changed South Africa.
But I think people forget just how wicked apartheid was, because it wasn't just like the Jim Crow laws in the States where black people were disadvantaged. It was a whole philosophy enforced by the state that black people should be kept in a subservient position. 18 million black people, 2 million whites, and the 18 million should always be servants. The Bantu Education Act was the classic example, where black people were not allowed to go to university because they must never rise above what was in effect a slave status. I went to South Africa leading amnesty missions throughout the 1980s, and I was banned at the end, and I wasn't allowed to meet Nelson Mandela, who was for those 28 years in prison and became an icon because of his courage. But you just had to be there to see this degree of segregation. The hospitals were segregated, the ambulances were segregated, the park benches were segregated. It was a thoroughgoingly evil system, and that was why apartheid was condemned internationally, and there was a convention against it. But of course in Australia, growing up in the 60s, we weren't bothered at all. We played cricket and football games against teams that were... black people were excluded. They weren't allowed to train. They weren't allowed to become members of clubs. They were strictly segregated. And a few friends of mine who played in the Wallaby side travelled into South Africa in 1969, and they were appalled at what they saw. The black people were put behind the goalpost. They barracked for Australia. They couldn't work out why they were barracking for Australia until they realised just how oppressed they were. And I did an interview with them, one of my first publications, which went out in the Australian, about how sport and politics were interwoven and how playing against segregated sides was encouraging apartheid in South Africa. And they said, these four players, that they could not play against a segregated side. That interview in 1970, their courage in saying, never can we play against a South African white-only side, rather transformed the debate. Previously it had only been university students and a few left-wingers who were opposed to sport with South Africa. But these four were immediately blacklisted by the rugby union authorities, were denounced and condemned. But the word got out. Whitlam became leader of the Labour Party, and he approved the idea of stopping sport with South Africa. Of course, the McMahon government wouldn't ban the team, egged on by the right-wing premiers of the time, Vijelke Peterson and Askin and Bolte. But something happened in 1970 that transformed the situation. The ACTU got a new president, and that new president, Bob Hawke, took a great stand. He stopped the unions doing anything for that tour, and the tour of this white-only South African team became a complete shambles. They couldn't fly, the planes wouldn't take them, they couldn't go by train. It was, thanks to Bob, a complete shambles. And the union movement, under his dynamic leadership, actually stood up for anti-apartheid movement. And then another great Australian entered the scene. He had a long letter conversation with Meredith Bergman, who was an anti-apartheid protester, and eventually decided that no cricket tests would be played with segregated teams. That was Don Bradman, who was head of the Australian Cricket Board. And never will we play South Africa, he said, until their teams are, until blacks are able to play in their teams. It took 20 years, but it was that stand in 1970 by Bob Hawke and Don Bradman that changed the Australians' perspective and turned Australians against South Africa. It put a new value, I think, into the Australian heart. It was a great event. Thank you so much, Bob, for your leadership.
And this week at the International Bar Association conference, I learned something that I'd forgotten, and it was taught by Edwin Cameron. Now, Edwin Cameron is a judge of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, appointed by Nelson Mandela. And he is not only openly gay, but he is openly HIV. And he said, you know, that he's the only official in the whole of the African continent who is open about his HIV status. But he reminded me that apartheid had been declared to be a crime against humanity. Not only is there a convention against it specifically, but it was declared to be a crime against humanity. And the issue in the session that we were talking about was, is the discrimination that exists in so many countries still, with criminal laws, punishments, isolation, hostility against gays in the world and in many Commonwealth countries, is that also a crime against humanity? Is that something which is punishing and discriminating against people for something they don't choose, can't change, and which is just part of their essential humanness? Similarly against women, similarly against people of different races and different abilities.
It's an important issue.
It is an important issue. And thank you, Bob, for your statement last week about this so-called postal survey that we're going through at the moment. The worst decision of any Prime Minister since Federation. That might be a... That might have been a slightly un-Hawke-like exaggeration, but it wasn't far from the mark, in my opinion.
Well, it's always a great embarrassment to the million or so expatriate Australians that not only Manus Island and Nauru, but the slackness in Australia, again, compared with all other advanced nations in permitting gay marriage, is really something that is quite embarrassing, notwithstanding the fact that as dual citizens we can't apparently stand for Parliament. But that is a matter on which, of course, I won't draw you, because it would, if you were to deliver a judgment, it would be the shortest Kirby judgment in history. The next topic we were going to talk about...
I knew that was coming.
The next topic we were going to talk about was torture. As President Trump talks about waterboarding, does torture work? I'll kick off on this because it's been sadly a subject of my study. 71 countries, according to Amnesty, still do torture. And it is sad, but it is true that people believe in the ticking time bomb. You know, if a terrorist has placed a time bomb and the clock is ticking, that's the time for torture. And of course, this is nonsense, because those who are so far gone in their crazed beliefs that they will plant a ticking time bomb will not give the true information if they are tortured, and if they are, they'll give false information and waste police time. The ticking time bomb scenario never works. And indeed, what is so important, I don't know whether you read it, it was quite long, was the Congress, the US Congressional report in 2015 on the torture works that had been done in Guantanamo, the euphemisms for torture that were used. Waterboarding sounds like a nice surfing event, but it was one of the euphemisms. Environmental manipulation was used. Well, that means subjecting someone for hours to high-pitched sounds of cats meowing and babies crying and Yoko Ono singing. And quite seriously. And anal hydration. They didn't even say what that was. These were the euphemisms that were developed by the CIA for torture at Guantanamo, and they never worked. The Congressional Committee made a full study and decided that torture had never produced useful information. And you know what produced the information that led them to bin Laden in Islamabad? They offered a suspect a cup of tea, and he told them. So there it is. But it's very easy for liberals to say torture never works, because in fact torture sometimes does work. Yes. You remember the Tosca, the second act of Tosca, where the tenor is being tortured and the soprano, somewhat naively, gives the hiding place in an attempt to stop the torture. Some of Pinochet's tortures, where children were tortured in front of their parents, where loved ones are subjected to the most vicious torture, rape, by dogs in some cases in Pinochet's camps, that can cause people to stop the torture of a loved one. But these tortures are so inhumane and hideous that no advanced country could consider them. So I don't think...
That's why there's an anterior question, not does it work, but is it lawful, is it right, is it effective? Effective, I think, is the last question. The first question is it lawful? And there is an international convention against it. I agree with you, sometimes torture does work, but the question is whether it should be part of a state policy in any case, even if it sometimes works. And the international community has come down strongly against it, but there are still people who want to support it and say, oh, well, if they've got an atomic bomb and they're threatening to use it, there are exceptional circumstances. It's all a question of proportionality. but lending the authority of the state to torture is forbidden by international law.
That's right. Okay, the next one was, what's your human rights hero? We've spoken about Mandela. Who would you single out? Aung San Suu Kyi? Well, I would have thought the Nobel Committee, which is funded by the Profits on Gunpowder, should actually withdraw the Nobel Prize from Aung San Suu Kyi.
Yes, well, I don't want to get into that, and I don't want to say that everybody falls into the same category. For example, when I served in Cambodia, a special representative of Secretary General Boutros Ghali, I observed an Australian soldier who was working on the removal of landmines, and he is definitely a human rights hero. It was very dangerous work. It was so insidious, they would plant the landmines in the villages on the path that the villagers would take for the toilet. Yeah. And the net result of that was so many people with horrendous injuries. So Shorty Coleman, he's somewhere out here in Australia, and he was an Aussie soldier who led the efforts in Cambodia back in the 1990s to deal with that problem. But if I had to choose somebody, I think I would choose Eleanor Roosevelt, because Eleanor Roosevelt was not only a very brave and wonderful woman in herself, constantly causing trouble for her husband, constantly trying to get FDR to do something about the racial discrimination in the United States, going to meetings in the Deep South where the audience was on one side white and on one side black, and walking immediately to the black side and sitting with the black side. But her work on the committee with Dr. Evatt as the President of the General Assembly, her work on the committee that delivered the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which will be 70 years next year, I think that was really the beginning of the international community's effort to declare what fundamental human rights were and to develop the treaties that will hold countries to account. And that is what now takes place in the UN system. It's not perfect, it's like Runnymede, it's the beginning of the international response. But Eleanor had a lot to do with that. And as a little boy in Concord in Sydney, Australia, I was sat on the gutter as Eleanor went by. She drove by in a motorcade up to the Repatriation General Hospital in Concord, and I was waving the flag, and I swear she looked at me.
I thought I thought it was the Queen we all had to wave the flag for.
We did that too. Geoffrey.
Yes, that was dreadful, having to sit at the showground in 95-degree heat.
Oh, stop complaining.
As your other idol went past so quickly that you couldn't see. A kid's falling over from sunstroke. It was my first experience of torture.
Another crime against humanity, I suppose.
I did but see her passing by, but so quickly I became a lifelong Republican.
Move on, Geoffrey.
Well, we haven't talked about royalty, but I do think, you're on this Commonwealth Elders Committee. What are you going to do when the Queen passes on as head of the Commonwealth?
Well, we just do what we do all the time. We have a system that provides for that very moment.
Well, the British are trying to say that the system means that Prince Charles will be head of the Commonwealth. But a lot of the Black Commonwealth don't want him. They want someone inspirational. And there's Aung San Suu Kyi has blotted her copybook, so we can't have her. Graça Machel is still going strong, but she's getting on. But and of course the palace sent to Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister, some flunky, to try to get Australia's vote for Prince Charles. But you know, and you should know, that because you're on the Commonwealth Elders Committee, that there is the perfect head of the Commonwealth. has just become available, because all you need to be head of the Commonwealth is to have one parent born in a Commonwealth country. And there's a guy who's utterly inspirational, charismatic, and bring the Commonwealth up against Donald Trump. And he's now got a parent born in Kenya. And he's now available. Barack Obama should be crowned as head of the Commonwealth.
Geoffrey, this is the very reason that you have the monarch, because the very reason is it's historical, it is not and should not be political, and if you don't like Prince Charles, with all respect, within a very short time you'll have Will and Kate, and that will be very popular, very effective. So it's not an immediately pressing problem. You know, the Queen's mother lived to 101, and Her Majesty looks in very good health. She's never smoked. She has been very careful about her diet, and I don't think we'll be needing to deal with this problem for quite a while yet. I hope not.
Well, there you go. But it's no longer, Michael, the British Commonwealth. It's just the Commonwealth.
The British Commonwealth since 1938, I think.
Anyway, my human rights hero was Robert Ratchatunga. No one's ever heard of him. I came across him in a place called Venda, which no one's ever heard of. It was one of the satellite puppet republics that South Africa set up in the 70s to pretend that it was treating black people, giving them a measure of independence. But of course it tightly controlled it. And this guy was sentenced. I was an Amnesty observer leading a mission there, and he was offered a deal. He'd given a plate of porridge to some of the boys in the bush, and he was threatened with 10 years in a malaria-infested prison. But because there was an Amnesty mission in town, they offered him a deal. They said, we won't send you to prison if you acknowledge the state of Venda. And he was so principled that he refused. And I saw him and talked to him and said, look, you're going to die if they send you to prison. He said, nonetheless, I can never acknowledge the state of the South African puppet state of Venda. And I was so overwhelmed by this principled man of little learning, little education, but he was just so determined not to bow down to the slave apartheid system. But as you have Eleanor Roosevelt, I have Václav Havel, because I actually worked with him. He was the philosopher-playwright who became, after years of being in and out of prison, he became the great president of Czechoslovakia. And we'd have lunch together overlooking the Vltava River in Prague, and any moment he could be seized and taken back to prison. I remember once I tried to pay, or I got out to pay with American dollars, which everyone used in this country, where local money was worthless. And he said, horrified, he said, no, you mustn't. I'll be arrested. They'll use this as an excuse. He said, and it's Kafkaesque irony. He said, this is the thing about being a dissident. You must scrupulously obey the law. And he had a degree of humor. We went to the trial of the Jazz Society in Stalinist Prague. They were afraid of jazz because it was music you could talk under and conspire under. And so they put the president of the Jazz Society on trial for alleged fraud. And I went over there every time he came up in court. I don't like jazz. You always think it will turn into a tune, and it doesn't. But we observed because we created some sort of international fuss, they gave him only 2 years and not 7 years, and so we walked out on the steps of Charles Square where the court is, and a few hundred people in the square who broke out into "We shall overcome." And I said to Havel, this is very heartening that young people are supportive. And he said, yes, he said, and on occasions like this, you always know who are the police spies. I said, how? He said, they're the ones who know all the words.
But I've lost the point of this. I mean, today we were at the IBA meeting and we were being told about the president of Poland and the way horrible things are happening in Poland to judges in that country. So, there are masterful, wonderful people like Havel, but there are also some pretty horrible people as well.
I mean, the great thing about Havel was that he had a vision. He wasn't just a reformer.
He was an amazing man.
He was amazing. He had this determination to
what's the point?
To redraw the map.
What's your point?
Well, he's my human rights hero. But what's happening in Eastern Europe today is very worrying it's happening because of right-wing nationalist anti-immigrant parties getting power and trying to curb, for example, the independence of the judiciary. We talked a lot about that this morning at the International Bar Association.
We sure did.
All right. Next one, must roads fall? This is the roads must fall, the idea of toppling statues of people whose historical crimes have come home to roost.
And this is for your university at Oxford, and with the statue of Rhodes. Is it at the college or is it somewhere else?
No, it's at Oriel College, where Zelman Cowen was provost. It stood there for a long time, and the black Rhodes scholars...
Don't you think there's a difference between, say, we've had a debate in Australia, you may have missed it, but we had a debate...
Stan Grant did raise the issue, didn't he,
Well, we had a debate about the statue of Captain Cook in Sydney. Now, I think there's an absolutely enormous difference between people like Captain Cook or Governor Phillip. Phillip, indeed, was a very forward-looking man, and not a single convict died on the First Fleet. And he also insisted on equal justice for Aboriginals and put up signs warning the soldiers about the need to treat Aboriginals.
And his first law. Do you know what his first law was while he
No
waited?
shackled slave.
No. Australia. This will be a free society, and there will be no slavery.
Yes.
That was the first law of Australia.
That was in his instructions.
And you judges have never mentioned it.
From the Crown. From the Crown. No shackled slave.
No shackled slave. But he was a great
and
figure.
Captain Cook, Cook didn't come out here to take land away for the Aboriginal. He came out on a scientific expedition, and it was just that when they lost the American colonies and had to find somewhere to send their prisoners, somebody remembered, what about that thing by James Cook? And that's what planted the idea. But Cook was a most amazing navigator.
The real villains in Australian history are not Cook and Phillip, who didn't take land away from Aborigines. But in 1836, some real villains, greedy and dishonest villains, took a lot of land away from Aborigines. Hindmarsh and Light. You know that?
Well,
the 1836 joint stock company of these greedy people who were selling land in South Australia.
Are you talking about the ancestors of these people before?
I most certainly am.
These were the only people who came to Australia who were not convicts.
Exactly. They came to Australia as greedy profiteers. They came to Australia as there was a proviso in the Act that settled Adelaide, and it was a remarkable thing because in 1836 the British Parliament had heard of the destruction of Aborigines in Tasmania and New South Wales from Dunmore Lang. He'd gone over, and the British Parliament described it as an indelible stain, title of Henry Reynolds' book. And because of that awareness in Britain, the king who granted the Joint Stock Company the opportunity to settle South Australia inserted a famous proviso in the settlement document saying that the land rights of the native inhabitants should be respected.
This was something common in all the colonies. The Crown always insisted on that. Then the governors tried to impose it, but the settlers then told the governors where to get lost, and in the end, many of these provisions were not properly respected.
But I think it's a real question. I mean, Hindmarsh and Light and Fletcher
but
did...
let's come back to the question of the statues.
Yeah, exactly.
That is a particularly beautiful statue in Adelaide of Light, looking at.
Well, if it's particularly beautiful,
looking at its order, looking at the beautiful layout and the presentation.
No, I think it should go. I mean, this guy
I'd leave the statue alone.
He's a thief. He robbed the Aborigines of their rights to land, and I think that's a matter that, look, if it's beautiful, if it's a good architectural work, then perhaps you should add to the inscription that this man stole the land from the Aborigines. I really do. That's the historical fact.
Well, can we negotiate about the verb stole? I think some different way of expressing it, we might find some common ground here, but pulling down his statue, I really think that's...
Well, I've given you the fact that if it's architecturally beautiful, then it can stay. But there must be some reference on the plinth or underneath it. We should chisel something to the effect that he breached the trust of the British government and stole the land from the Aborigines.
But I think where there is a case where the person who is memorialised in a statue can be shown to have committed, say, crimes against humanity, like Stalin in the former Soviet Union, then I think there is a case, or maybe like some of the people who were the leaders of the South in the United States. They've just taken out windows of the National Cathedral in Washington of people who were the leaders of the Confederate movement in the United States and the Civil War. So I do think that there are cases where it is an affront to have the statues standing. But I'm not so sure that Light or Cook or Phillip in Australia...
But it's a real issue. I mean, in Bristol, they're talking about taking down the statues of a great philanthropist who built all their hospitals, but he built them on the profits he made out of the slave trade. And this is a question of recognizing historical truth, but it may depend. I mean, in Ukraine, they pulled down a big statue of Frederick Engels, because they hated the Russians. And it was bought by the Corporation of Manchester, who took it to Manchester and re-erected Frederick Engels, who's now quite popular in the age of Jeremy Corbyn. So it does. But I do think I recently, this year, went on a holiday in the French Riviera to Villefranche-sur-Mer. And for those of you who are film buffs, it was where Dirty Rotten Scoundrels was shot, the Michael Caine movie. And beautiful, utterly beautiful building. And, of course, it was owned by Leopold II. Leopold II of Belgium, who made the French Riviera, but also killed 10 million people in the Congo. And there was a monument to him, and I couldn't work out why someone hadn't written in blood red, assassin, genocidaire. I wouldn't have minded that. I think that's the kind of action that should be taken.
What's your view on the statue of Rhodes in Oxford?
My view is, oddly, that...
Given that the Rhodes scholarships, of which you were a beneficiary...
And Bob Hawke. That's why I applied. I had a choice. I could have applied for the Robert Gordon Menzies Scholarship to Harvard or the Rhodes Scholarship, and I thought at 19 I could never go through life as a Menzies scholar. In 50 years' time, this dreadful man who sent my mates to be killed in Vietnam, he'll be a laughingstock. As for Rhodes, when we got to Oxford with Julian Disney, actually, who was the Rhodes from South Australia, we had to get ourselves involved in a revolt because they'd never had a black Rhodes scholar. And 50 years later, of course, the black Rhodes scholars that our revolt brought into being are now demanding that this little statue of Rhodes should go. And I must have passed it hundreds of times, as must you, Bob, the statue in the niche at Oriel College, which it's got a gauze over the top to stop the pigeons. But it's there not, I think the key factor is that it's not there to celebrate Rhodes as a person who did so much to kill black people in South Africa, but it's there simply because he donated vast sums of money to the church. It's not triumphalist in the way other statues are. So I think...
So if you give a lot of money, this is your principles. I'm just trying to understand your principles, Geoffrey.
My principles are those of Robert Mugabe, the great race warrior, who said that there was a movement to dig up Rhodes's bones, his grave is in a very beautiful place in the Matapo Hills. And Mugabe resisted it. He said, no. He said, we don't mind the bones there, but they must earn us money. And that was from the tourist trade. So I think what I do with this little statue is simply remove the gauze and let him suffer the pigeon droppings of history. What are we going to talk about now? Before we go out and desecrate Colonel Light. Here you are. Here's one for you. What do you do with a problem like North Korea?
Yes, well, first of all, we've got a very big security problem with the North Koreans having developed nuclear weapons of very great power. The last test was on the 3rd of September, so it's only weeks ago. And it appears to have been a hydrogen bomb. It appears to be a fusion bomb which explodes inwardly and has the greater power, and it's therefore intensely dangerous. And I thought it was a case that they had about 20 of these nuclear warheads with growing miniaturization, but it does seem now, the reports seem to say, they have 60. And that they've made them small, and of course they've also developed the missiles and submarine launch missiles, so we've got a very big security issue. But as well as that, we've got the issue that I was mandated to investigate, which was the issue of human rights in North Korea. And that issue in our report showed really terrible and barbarous treatment of the people of North Korea, who are human beings too and who are suffering greatly and who have been the victims of crimes against humanity, which the international community promised it would not look away from but would respond to. And so we've got this double problem. But I think at least a couple of things have come out of our report. The investigation in South Korea, the continued investigation of those who are complaining about North Korea in the form of a prosecutor's brief so that when in due course accountability can be demanded, it will all be there, it will all be prepared. But the other interesting thing, Geoffrey, that happened recently on the 7th of July this year was the fact that 122 nations came together in the United Nations and adopted the form of a nuclear weapons ban treaty.
But not the major nations.
No, they
not
didn't
Russia
turn
or America.
No, none of the permanent five and none of the other nations with the weapons. But this is like the world is now saying, we've waited for you guys, you have the weapons, and it's said that it's a waste of time having a treaty if you don't come to the party. But we are now going to stand up for our citizens. This is intensely dangerous. We are now in a position where the use of these weapons could obliterate the entirety of living matter on the planet. And when you read that wonderful book by Christopher Clarke on the sleepwalkers and how accidentally, almost without a thought, the world marched into the First World War, which contributed to the Second World War and all the things that have happened, we really have to act on a basis that unless we do act, there is really going to be a real risk that, if not deliberately, then at least by some accident mistake or misreading of the data.
Terrorists have already got close to Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. That's certainly true. But I wonder whether I could put up a defense of North Korea. Well, I've defended Mike Tyson, so I'll do it this way. I think that we don't appreciate the importance of historical events, historical oppression. A lot of the Iranian rhetoric against Britain and America is because the CIA and MI6 overthrew Mossadegh back in 1956, a great democratic figure. So they're now the little
Is this defence to the crimes against humanity?
It's an explanation of the kind of Fat Boy Kim and his rhetoric, because we tend to forget what happened in Korea, the Korean War in 1953. 3 years, America bombed every Skerika building in the north. And they napalmed the North. And they dropped biological weapons, I think. There is no certainty that they did, but the evidence very much points to that, and the North Koreans believe it.
So this excuses the crimes against
humanity? No, this explains the reason why the North Koreans have been obsessed with getting nuclear weapons. And Julie Bishop wrote a piece yesterday in which she said their acquisition of nukes was illegal. It wasn't. That's a fundamental error. They withdrew from the NPT perfectly lawfully. They shouldn't have been allowed to withdraw. The Non-Proliferation Treaty. They withdrew from it and developed the bomb. Just as Israel never joined it and developed the bomb, just as India was allowed to develop the bomb by the Nixon regime, just as Pakistan developed the bomb. And so we have this extraordinary situation where the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was designed to allow the Big Five to have their nuclear weapons and no one else, but if you withdrew, as North Korea did, they were entitled to develop it. Now, I think the only way forward, other than by flattening North Korea again or embroiling ourselves in some kind of nuclear event in the Pacific, is to allow North Korea back in the NPT as a nuclear power, and maybe demand that Israel, India and Pakistan become nuclear powers, and then put them under scrutiny from Vienna.
But doesn't that raise the question of who is next on the list, and what other small country. This is a country with 24 million people, the same as Australia, with the third biggest land army in the world, with now 60 nuclear warheads. They've apparently, by very brilliant technology, they've mastered making the bombs miniatures.
That's right.
This is very dangerous, and if North Korea gets away with it, doesn't that mean that some other...
It's not a question of getting away with it. North Korea has acted lawfully in building its bombs.
Well, don't make it too lawful. I mean, they've simply, they denounced the non-proliferation treaty.
They withdrew from it.
Why do they do this?
Why should they be in a worse position than Israel, India or Pakistan, who've got hundreds of bombs? So I think that the only way forward is to accept the reality of the situation, that there are no longer 5 nuclear powers, there are 9, and to actually control the development and bring those 9 powers under the legal, as the World Court said in 1996, to bring them under the duty to gradually reduce to nil their nuclear power. That seems to me the only way that you can, without the danger of war, that you can bring North Korea into and offer them also an independent investigation into the biological warfare that they claim America engaged in. The B-52 pilots confessed, and then of course as soon as they got back to America they said their confessions were tortured out of them, but towards the end of their lives a number of them restated the fact that they did drop biological weapons, and there was a mission.
You want to go back into what is said to have happened, may or may not have happened in 1950. I want to talk about the here and now, and of a state of 24 million people who've now got 60 nuclear warheads and amazing missiles, submarines that expand their capacity to deliver it. I certainly agree with you that there need to be talks. I certainly agree there needs to be discussion. The Commission of Inquiry recommended that. Playing no talks is really a childish
Because what's the
approach to
alternative? I mean, if flatten North Korea, bomb it to pieces yet again?
No, I don't think that's on, and I don't think that anyone is really suggesting that. Though there have been some strange tweets.
The general
very strange tweets at 2 a.m. Washington time.
Trump's America certainly have. And if you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, you remember that it was the General Curtis LeMay who led the napalming of North Korea in 1953. It was all for attacking Cuba. And that would have perhaps likely led to a nuclear war. So,
well, we've solved the Korean problem.
Right,
what's the next thing on our agenda?
Will Julian Assange ever come home? That's for me, I guess. Look, Julian Assange is still in Ecuador. By a miracle of international law, the embassy that's opposite Harrods is part of Ecuadorian territory, and if he leans too far over, the police will catch him, and he'll be in Britain. But Scotland Yard once heard a rumour that at night he'd climb up to the top of the building and smoke Cuban cigars, and they ordered a snatch squad. The SAS were going to pick him up, but then their lawyers said that the immunity of an embassy extends to the sky. So they couldn't do that. But I introduced him to Dick Smith, who became quite a fan and worked out that he could get him off on a helicopter. But he couldn't get him back to Australia without running out of petrol.
But now the Swedes have dropped the sex case against him, and therefore his fear that he would be taken back to Sweden and then sent from there by a deal between Sweden and the United States to the United States, which he thought would be very dangerous for him. And I can understand that point of view. But now that isn't a risk, what is his problem?
Oh, well, he broke bail. so that he will, if he comes out of the embassy, he'll be arrested, held overnight. We won't be able to get him out for a day or so, and then America will pounce, because we discovered last year in an action that was the FBI brought against Google that they want to charge him under the Espionage Act with imprisonment up to 45 years
Did
imprisonment.
he owe a duty to them under the Espionage?
Well, this
He
is
was
the
not
question. I mean, he's an Australian. He's an Australian publisher, and it's surely, we would argue, exorbitant jurisdiction for America to claim that he was breaking the Espionage Act while he wasn't an American and he was outside America when he did so.
And will you be putting that argument up to a court in England? In the event that
no, he's not coming out at the moment. I don't think he's quite relies on my advocacy to succeed immediately. And I think 45 years in an American supermax, and he will not get the clemency that was extended to Chelsea
Well, I
Manning.
think it all depends on the development of politics in the United Kingdom. If Mr. Corbyn becomes the Prime Minister, he would possibly give advice to the Queen to extend some clemency to him, and he would then, as a citizen of Australia, be entitled to come back to Australia and live a quiet and peaceful life, not causing any more trouble.
But I think
for
America
everybody.
might have difficulty extraditing him for 45 years in a supermax from Australia. Whether they would have the same difficulty in England is yet to be seen. But there have also been tergiversations in the American position. I mean, last year Trump was tweeting, "I love WikiLeaks." This year, the CIA director said that WikiLeaks was a hostile foreign intelligence agency, and they were giving priority, he used the word priority, to the arrest of Assange. So there he sits in a converted toilet in the Ecuadorian embassy, and it's and
But
he's
I think
likely
the
to
answer to
remain.
your question is he will come back to Australia, and it'll all just depend on how it all plays out. And he won't go to the United States, and then you can rest quietly and get on with another human rights case, possibly with more merit. I mean, I think there was merit in the release of a lot of the material in the WikiLeaks, but there were also, apparently, it was indiscriminating, and there were the names of agents and others who were at risk.
That's not right. The CIA had to admit at the sentencing hearing for Chelsea Manning that there had been no casualties, because the material that Chelsea Manning released was available to 3 million people, and it was not top secret. You're meant to classify as top secret any cable that would put a source in peril, and none of the material was top secret. But nonetheless, there are allegations that he's a front for the Russian government or for hostile Russian agencies, but his position is quite principled. It's that anything that comes into his hands in his electronic dead letter box, if it's important, he will publish it. And for that reason, he published the emails that showed the quite disgraceful behavior in the Democratic Commission. And that was dreadful, the way they attacked their own Bernie Sanders and took sides, and quite rightly. The chairman resigned. So it was of some importance, the material that he published, and I don't think whether or not it affected the American elections. But if the CIA was smart enough and fed Julian Assange some material about Putin's corruption, or certainly the corruption of his cronies, anonymously, I would think I would have enough faith to think that he would publish it.
A very persuasive argument for your client. But
let's move
these
on.
good people of Adelaide need to get away and go home, or go and see the light statue before somebody pulls it down.
Well, I think go and desecrate
And
it.
is there another one of your interrogations?
Can the Queen be replaced? Well, I think we've dealt with that. Has international justice stalled?
Well, I think international justice is in an early phase of development, and the problem is that the world needs international justice more than ever. But at least I got the feeling in the work on North Korea that we were conducting our inquiry. It had the overwhelming support of the United Nations. It got very strong votes in the Human Rights Council, in the General Assembly, and it was put on the agenda of the Security Council.
But Michael, that was because North Korea had no friends. No friends.
Yes,
much
North
worse.
Korea it had some very powerful friends.
Well,
had the People's Republic of China, and it
yes.
had the Russian Federation, and it also had a number of countries that always voted for them.
But it was a pariah state in a way that Assad and Syria...
Why? You've got to ask yourself why.
Yeah, but the reason why the action against Assad has not been taken is because Russia will veto it, because Russia has its Mediterranean fleet stationed permanently, it wants it stationed permanently, in a Syrian port. Now, if you think back to 2011, and it's the saddest picture, I think, in my mind, remember those young people demonstrating in the streets, and they had banners, El-Assad to The Hague. And this was a kind of representation to me of the over great expectations that international justice had engendered. And of course, they were shot. 800 of them over the first 3 months were just machine gunned. And I remember writing a piece saying, this is now a crime against humanity. Assad should be referred to the ICC. And it wasn't. And he kept killing. 400,000 people have now been killed. 5 million Syrians are refugees in other countries. 6 million refugees in their own country. This is an indictment of international justice. It has stalled.
Yes, but what's your solution? I mean, I agree with all that you've said, but the fact of the matter is we have at least begun the process of changing it from the sovereign nation states that are able to do what they want to do in their own country to places where they are now accountable. And if they're not accountable in a court, they're certainly accountable before the bar of international opinion. And in the Security Council, there have been developments against North Korea, and there have been unanimous votes against North Korea. There have been increasingly strong sanctions against North Korea. So, okay, it's not perfect, and okay, it's very imperfect. But at least we've begun, and you've got to say what your solution is.
Well, I don't think there is a
have another solution.
We could go on and talk about the genocide of the Yazidis and the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya.
Yes, we know all this.
And of course we know all this. The question is, what has happened to international justice? Has it faltered? Is it time to despair? I think it's not, because as you point out, we only started delivering on the Nuremberg legacy 50 years later with the introduction of international courts. We are in early days, and it may be that the development of the threat of nuclear war coming closer will concentrate minds. There has been movement against ISIS, even at least using the Iraqis as surrogates. I think that there have been developments, and as you know, I've been very involved in Magnitsky laws, which I see as a way forward. While international justice may stall in relation to those countries and leaders which have superpower support. If you're supported by Russia or if you're supported by America, you'll never go to jail. Although we have Charles Taylor in jail, and Mladic and Karadzic, and we have made a start on friendless countries. But there is a development which is very important, I think, potential, and it's called a Magnitsky law. Sergei Magnitsky was the lawyer who was beaten to death in a Russian prison after exposing a particularly corrupt group of policemen. And the judges who insisted that he shouldn't get bail when he should have, the policemen who organized the fabricated case against him, and others were listed in America under what was called the Magnitsky law. They were not allowed to have bank accounts. Their assets in America were seized. And the European Union has recently adopted Magnitsky law principles. Now, it's not particularly powerful at this point, although Australia could adopt a Magnitsky law. It means that when you identify human rights violators from other countries, you don't allow them to bring their money in, and you don't allow them to send their families here for education or medical treatment. That's a big factor. And while normally you don't punish the children or the parents of criminals, because the torturers and criminals that I've dealt with have very often done it to gain money for their family, I don't think it's a bad thing to stop them bringing their children to Geelong Grammar, or to stop them bringing themselves or their parents for hospital treatment. It's a way of getting at, if you like, the train drivers to Auschwitz, those who assist in human rights violations.
Yes, but I agree with much of what you've said, but through all of these failures, certain things shine through. The fact that the Nazi criminals were put on trial in the dock at Nuremberg remains a symbol and an inspiration. The fact that Eleanor Roosevelt and her colleagues, including H.V. Evatt, developed the international human rights framework and adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The fact that Bob Hawke, as leader of the ACTU, took steps in the industrial relations field to stand up for no discrimination against race on the basis of race, and no apartheid in sport. And the fact that the wonderful spirit of Nelson Mandela came out from Robben Island after 28 years and 7 months, and he came out with forgiveness and with kindness, and as a great inspiration to the rest of the world. I think we can be optimistic that things will progress so long as we keep these very dangerous weapons under control.
I agree with that. I think if looking forward, if I'd been back in the 60s, you and I were dealing with Vietnam, we were dealing with conscription, we were dealing with the death penalty. The death penalty was in vogue in the 60s. On all these issues that we were protesting about, apartheid and so on, we were on the right side of history, and we would be thrilled to have foreseen an Australia today when so many of the values that we were fighting for, the civil liberties values, are now accepted. Of course, there's Manus and Nauru. Of course, there's been the delay in gay marriage. But by and large, we've done pretty well, and I think that's reason for optimism. I also think, I was recently appearing in the European Court of Justice, some 20 judges from all over Europe, and the European Charter, where it was the first case to decide the meaning of the European Charter of Liberty, which has as its first principle the right to dignity, the right to human dignity. It was the first time that the court had to interpret that. And the question was, where does it come from, the European right to dignity? And I suggested that it was, I think I gave three sources: the Good Samaritan parable that had been translated in Europe, the idea of crossing the street to help someone, Portia's speech in The Merchant of Venice, the quality of mercy, and the imperative, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, basically do unto others.
And there'd be a few words of Nelson Mandela to throw
Well,
in
no, because he's not European. That was a different matter. But this was the
Europeans would listen
European
to
source. But the incredible thing is I looked at the court and realized that over half the judges would have had parents, and certainly grandparents, who were probably either collaborating with or in the Nazi forces. And here we were, just 60 years after the war, with their grandchildren talking about the right to dignity in Europe. And it was that within living memory of these atrocities that were dealt with at Nuremberg. I think you just have to be optimistic.
That's the take-home message. You've got to be optimistic, but you've got to do things.
Ladies and gentlemen, a man who needs no introduction, former Prime Minister Bob Hawke, will offer the vote of thanks.
Vice-Chancellor, Uncle Lewis, all other distinguished guests and dear friends. The first thing I want to do tonight is, well, I said last night, the University of Adelaide and the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre have set themselves the noble task of projecting into the South Australian community the inspiration to think. And I'm very proud to be associated with that project. We had a marvellous example of it last night with a great speech by Julia. And I said then that I wanted to thank the people of South Australia, Adelaide in particular, for the way in which over the years you have so marvellously responded by your attendance and your attention. And you have certainly done that again tonight. Thank you very much indeed for your cooperation and your participation. And thank you, of course, to you, Michael, and to you, Geoffrey. And I want to make a few comments about not all the subjects you covered, some of which, with respect, I could not get excited about, e.g. statues.
There'll be some of you, Bob.
Well, you look after them.
Yeah.
Of course, I want to start with and really concentrate upon your remarks about Nelson Mandela. He was, without doubt, the most outstanding human being I met as Prime Minister. And although this will sound somewhat self-aggrandising, I suppose, I want to say that the proudest moment of my Prime Ministership was when he made that first visit to Australia after his release, that first visit outside Africa. And when this marvellous man who exuded integrity, boundless energy, bounded into my room, bounded across to me, held out his hand. He said, "Bob, I want you to know I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you." Now, I was involved, but I was acting for this great country, Australia, when I thought up the scheme in 1987 at the Commonwealth Heads of Government and said trade sanctions aren't working, we need investment sanctions. I said I can get Jim Wolfenson up from New York, talk to him, they agreed. Jim came, I made Treasury people available, and they applied, and within 2 years apartheid was crumbling, and it finished at the end of '89. And to meet that man was a thrill. We went into my office, and I said to him, "Nelson, I know this is difficult, but if you are going to optimise your chances of lifting the state of South Africa and the condition of its people, particularly of the black people, then you are going to have to hand out the hand of cooperation to the whites who have treated you and your people so abominably." And he memorably answered me with these words. He said, "Bob, I cannot forget, but I can forgive." And I thought that was marvellous. I took him in then to the cabinet room where my colleagues were meeting him, and I wanted to get him to say those things so they could all hear. And sitting behind Nelson were a whole lot of his advisors, including obviously a number of black advisors. And I'll always remember that when he made that reply, there were a few shaking heads and doubtful looks amongst some of those colleagues, but he was true to his word. I also would like to sort of tell you the story because you mentioned Don Bradman. I'll tell you exactly what happened. I led the fight in 1971 against the Springboks tour, to which you have made generous reference. And when that was over, phone went to my office and it was Don Bradman. And he said, "Bob, I'd like very much if you would come over to Adelaide sometime and see me. There's something I want to talk to you about." So I said, "Of course, Don." So a few days later, and he said, "Please keep it secret." So I flew over and put my gear in the hotel and got a cab down to his home in Kensington. And we sat down and he produced a beer, by the way. And I wondered, well, this must be good affair. He said, "I won this." I thought, my God, this must be pretty bloody old, but he'd had a bet with the head of the brewery some time before, and he'd received this. So I shared a beer with him, and he said, "Bob," he said, "obviously what I want to talk to you about is that we've got a South African cricket tour coming up, and I don't want all the trouble that's been associated with this tour of the Springboks, with which you have been so very much associated." And he said, "Bob," he said, "I just think that politics and sport shouldn't mix." I said, "Don, I couldn't agree with you more. That is exactly my point. It was the government of South Africa which introduced politics into sport by its decision to ban the majority of its population representing its country. That was the introduction of politics into sport. Don was a shrewd man. He looked at me, thought, and his reply was simple. Bob, I have no argument against that. And so we had Don on side, and it all worked out so well. I next will just make a brief comment or two about your comments about the Republic. I'm a Republican, I supported the Republic, but I want to say this. I have the most enormous respect for Her Majesty as head of the Commonwealth. This, as distinct from her role as head of the United Kingdom, which is purely a formal role, she has no part to play. But in the Commonwealth, she does play a part. She loves the Commonwealth. You can talk with the Queen about any of the 50-odd members of the Commonwealth, and she can speak intelligently about their politics, their economics, their culture. And she played a particular role in 1987. Again, was at the important conference where we got the end of apartheid going. And in that year, you'll remember Ram Booker had the military coup against the government and had ejected the Queen's representative. And listening to the debate that was going on in the conference, I was very worried that it was going to be a fairly soft resolution. After all, it had been a military coup and the Queen's representative had been thrown out. This was no small matter. So each head of government had his turn at meeting the Queen, so it's my turn to go around. And her private secretary was a bloke called Bill Heseltine, who was a contemporary of mine from the University of Western Australia. And I told him my concern. He said, I share your concern, Bob. Will you raise it with Her Majesty? I said, yes, of course. So I raised the question with her, explained my concern, and she made it very clear that she expressed her concern and that she would talk to other heads of government. And she did. And as a result of the Queen's personal intervention, a proper resolution was carried by the heads of government. Now, because I have so much respect for her, based on fact and not emotion, I would not be in favour of a situation which deposed her as our head of state. My suggestion is this, that a referendum should be put in these terms. Are you in favour of Australia becoming a republic? That condition to come into effect at the end of the reign of the present monarch. Now, I believe that if that referendum was put in those terms, I think it would be carried overwhelmingly, because the people would see that we were not being disrespectful or ungrateful to Her Majesty, that we were quite capable of putting our principle together with our personal judgments about her performance. And I think that's the way to handle it. Now, looking at the current state of politics, I don't know whether you're likely to get such a sensible decision. Statues. All I've got to say about that, as a Rhodes Scholar, a beneficiary of the old fellow, I would rather not see his statue taken down, but my simple point is, for me, there are so many much more important issues in the world that I don't really give a bugger. You spent some time talking about North Korea, as well you might if you were talking about current world issues, rule of law, etc. My approach to it would be this, and remember this fact, that the remarkable, historically unparalleled performance of China since its move to a market economy and opening up to the outside world at the end of the 1970s has had as a necessary condition the most peaceable environment in Asia in memory. It was absolutely essential if the Chinese were going to achieve that change, which has meant so much to China, to the region, to the world. It was responsible for the fall of the Soviet Union, the move of India towards a fully market economy. The most profound decision. And, as I say, that wouldn't and couldn't have happened without this peaceful environment. I've been to China now 106 times, and I think I can claim to know not only this leadership, but previous leadership, as well as any person outside of China. And I know from an experience that they will listen. In fact, on a number of issues when I was Prime Minister, I was able to act as an emissary, a go-between on their behalf with the United States. Particularly, they asked me to talk to the United States at a time when there was a lot of thinking in the United States that China was getting too close a relationship with the Soviet Union, and they asked me to explain to the United States leadership that their relationship with the Soviet Union was one of trade and economic convenience, and there was no suggestion of any warming of relations between them. So I know the Chinese leadership, and my suggestion would be that a group of leaders, not too many, should go to China and talk to President Xi, who is a remarkable man. He's intelligent, and he has a broad-ranging knowledge of world affairs. That this group of world leaders should go and see President Xi, explain the very genuine concern that they feel and is felt around the world of the possible disastrous consequences of the evolution of the current stalemate with North Korea. I do know this, that President Xi would listen to that. And if he would, then the idea would be to persuade him that he should support a visit to North Korea, or vice versa, a visit from the President of North Korea to America, where they could sit down with the knowledge that this was being done with the support of China and almost the whole of the rest of the world, and for the Americans to say, we are not interested in destroying your state. We accept the regime in political terms for what it is. But you must realise and understand that we can't continue to go on under the threats that you make, that you will launch attacks upon the United States. understand this is an absolutely honest message to you, Mr. President. Totally supported by China and the rest of the world. And if that could be done, we could look at the situation of economic assistance to your state, because, as you have said, the situation in North Korea is awful, and they could do with economic help. Now, this is not airy-fairy stuff. This is based on a lot of experience, a profound knowledge of the Chinese, and some acquired understanding of the nature of political leaders of all stripes around the world. That would be my approach to this issue. The final point, you mentioned just briefly Aboriginals and Australia. I want to make this point, that Australia will never be able to call itself a totally decent country while the large gaps between the Aboriginal people and the non-Aboriginal people continue. Those gaps in longevity, health, education and economic and social conditions, those gaps are appalling, and they're not shrinking in any significant degree. Just imagine what we're going through at the moment with what I've described as the worst economic decision by any Prime Minister in our history, spending $122 million bloody dollars on something that can have no effect. I believe, and I have publicly asserted such, that this postal vote should and will be carried. And I hope and believe it certainly will be carried. But then it can do nothing, absolutely nothing as a matter of law, as these legal experts will tell you. It cannot do anything as a matter of law. It then requires the action of the Parliament, which they should have had the guts to undertake in the first place. So, I conclude, Michael and Geoffrey, with these words. I said last night, I won't repeat in detail what I said, but the world is at a critical point in its history. Never been a more dangerous time. You talk about optimism. I want to be an optimist too. I launched, as you know, Gareth Evans' book the other day. It's called Incorrigible Optimist. I told him in very polite terms that was bullshit. That I was an optimist, but there's no ground for incorrigibility. But what the world does need in this time of greatest potential crisis and gravity are good people, as I said last night in thanking Julia. People like Julia also needs people like you, Michael, and you, Geoffrey, to help lead people to a proper understanding. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we reached the end of the evening, and I would like to take this time to not only thank our speakers, but also to thank the UniSA Law School's Dean, Professor Wendy Lacey, and the Executive Director of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, Jacinta Thompson, and their teams for their work in putting together this evening's lecture. I would like to remind you that a video of this lecture will be placed on the Hawke Centre's website next week, and while you're on the website, please look out for future events that might interest you that will be taking place in the remainder of the year. I would like to thank Bob, thank Geoffrey, thank Michael for a fantastic evening. Thank you all for coming out, and safe home.